Last night I sent to the President the following telegram. Mr. President, first of all, let me say that I fervently hope that your new efforts toward peace in Vietnam will succeed. Your decision regarding the presidency subordinates self to country and is truly magnanimous. I respectfully and earnestly request an opportunity to visit with you as soon as possible to discuss how we might work together in the interest of national unity during the coming months. Sincerely, Robert F. Kennedy. That wire sums up much of what I want to say today. The President's actions reflect both courage and generosity of spirit. In these past 16 days, I have been in 18 states, north, south, east, and west. In Alabama, and in Watts, in New York, and in New Mexico, in Washington, D.C., and in Washington State. Wherever I went, I found Americans of all ages and colors and political beliefs deeply desirous of peace in Vietnam and reconciliation at home. Despite all the discord and dispirit, despite all of the extremists and their actions, there remains in this country today an enormous reservoir of hope and goodwill. Americans want to move forward. They want to better their communities, to make this country not only more livable for all Americans, but a shining example for all of the world. To free their energies and progress at home, they want peace in Vietnam, produced not by surrender of either side, but by a negotiated settlement that realistically takes into account, as quickly as possible, the need for all Vietnamese, and only Vietnamese, to determine the future of their own country. I have long urged that we make the first step in this direction by a de-escalation of our military effort, halting the bombing of the North, insisting upon reforms in the South, and pressing for negotiations with all parties looking toward a transfer of the present conflict from the military to the political arena. I am hopeful that the actions announced by the President will prove to be a step toward peace. It is obviously a critical time, and I think it would be inappropriate to offer any detailed comments regarding those actions at this time. As we move toward a political resolution of the agony of Vietnam, we can start to redirect our national energies and resources toward the vital problems of our own national community. The crisis of our cities, the tension among our races, the complexities of a society once so rich and so deprived, all these call urgently for the best efforts of all Americans all across this country. We must reach across the false barriers that divide us from brothers and from countrymen, to seek and find peace abroad, reconciliation at home, and the participation in the life of our country that is the deepest desire of the American people and the truest expression of our national goals. In this spirit, I will continue my campaign for the presidency of the United States.
The strategy of desegregation, therefore, requires us to strike out in new directions. Our major effort will have to be in connection with low-income families. For the number of Negro families who can now afford to buy a home is relatively small. One important new direction was President Johnson's proposal last fall of federal aid to finance new town developments. The proposal was dropped from the housing bill at the time it was enacted. Resubmission of this proposal, together with a requirement that say 15% of the housing in a new town be set aside for low-income families, would be a major contribution. And the federal government should become the clearinghouse, the gatherer and the disseminator of information about housing desegregation. It can study and publicize ways in which communities are bringing about desegregation, and it can make original suggestions about desegregation. It would be a single contribution, for instance, if the federal government publicized the fact that numerous studies have shown that Negro entry on a block does not, in fact, lower property values. We might make planning assistance grants available to metropolitan area-wide areas for the specific purpose of planning for desegregation.
Oh, I just don't know whether that's going to be the answer. They go to an integrated school later on and have many difficulties and many problems. I think that the people themselves would have to explore that.
President Kennedy said that we have the capacity to make this the best generation in the history of mankind or make it the last. I think we can make it the best generation in the history of mankind. I think all of us joined together can make that difference.
You know, I just think that the situation is very unfortunate at the moment. It's not just a question of expenditure of funds, it's a question of the interest by the state and by the federal government in the Indians. And secondly, it's also going to be a major effort by the Indians themselves.
It doesn't seem really very practical, considering I won here in the state of, appear to have won in California, won in South Dakota, won by heavy margins in Nebraska, heavy margins in Indiana, and 2-1 in the District of Columbia. So, I mean, if we're in the primaries to present our candidacy to the people to see if we can gain support from the people, I think it's been quite clear where the support has gone.
This plight and the riots, which are its products and its symptoms, threaten to divide Americans for generations to come, to add to the ever-present difficulties of race and class, the bitter legacy of violence and destruction and fear. The riots which have taken place and the riots which we know may all too easily take place in the future are therefore an intolerable threat to the most essential interests of every American, black or white.
Means tomorrow, and then the next day I go to New York, or Thursday or Friday I come to New York, and we have some delegates that I'm supporting there in my own state that I will be working for over the period of the next 10 days. And I will also be going to some other states and to see if I can gain some support across the country. I think it's still wide open. As I say, I would, if I can gain the support of some of those who have supported Senator McCarthy, some of the citizen groups in the state who want a different direction for the United States, then I think that we have a chance of winning. If I don't gain that support, then I think it's going to be very difficult to keep Vice President Humphrey from gaining the nomination.
The question was, how about President Johnson and me? What about it? What are you trying to start a fight or something? And I said that in the past that I thought it was possible to have a coalition government in Saigon, but that doesn't mean it's possible here in the United States.
Well, I don't think that we should delude ourselves that a military action in North Vietnam above the 17th parallel is going to first give us any quick answer or quick victory in Vietnam. I think the war in Vietnam is going to have to be won in the South, and that effort is going to be successful only with military action plus political action. And a military action or effort through bombing or accelerated bombing, extending of the bombing in North Vietnam, is not going to be the solution or an answer for political action in South Vietnam.
Intention. I think in some of the key states they've waited. Ohio has waited, and the Vice President made a major effort for them to make that judgment before the California year and primary, but they have waited. Michigan decided this week that they would wait. Those are two key states.
Well, of course, Dick Daley is what.
And Illinois, of course, is terribly important. And then there are about 15 other states where there will be state conventions where we will have to be making an effort. So I would think, I don't think without any question anybody has the nomination. Secondly, I remember in 1960 when we were leading going into the convention, and that it was always very, very difficult, even up to the last moment, to ensure that you were going to get the nomination. I haven't even made that start to make the effort in any of these states yet. It is true the Vice President has moved around and he has been talking in these states, but I haven't even gone into these states yet. Well, I think that the primaries have indicated, as I said, that the Democratic Party, the rank and file want to move in a different direction, a new direction, and I think it would be the It would be a very bad mistake if that was ignored by the delegates at Chicago. But it's been a long campaign and a long effort, and I tried to go to present myself to the people themselves, rather than just to do it through television or do it through radio. I went to, I think in Nebraska, to every community over 2,000 population, and in many of these other states, 5,000 population. So I've made an effort, just because I think the people are entitled to see the candidate and talk to him and ask him questions. That's my reservations about Vice President Humphrey, who hasn't done that at all yet.
Well, I think that there is tremendous deprivation in those parts of the country, inadequate housing, and what we have here, of course, is a considerable amount of hunger. We have the children with distended stomachs in the large cities of the country, particularly in the north, where there is poverty. Still people can live on welfare so that the children don't suffer. Here, children as well as grown-ups are suffering, and as well as the housing being, of course, completely inadequate, and without any schooling because of the fact that the children have insufficient clothing. So, as I say, I think it's a terrible reflection on our society. I think that one of the great problems is, for most of us as American citizens, we don't run across it. We don't, for a citizen living under reasonably good conditions in our big cities, we don't pass through Bedford-Stuyvesant, we don't pass through Harlem. For a citizen living here in the state of Mississippi, you don't ordinarily run up against, if you're doing reasonably well, you don't run up against this kind of poverty. And certainly people elsewhere in the country have very little personal knowledge or information about it. But it exists, and it seems to me that we should do something about it. It's long overdue, and I don't think an inadequate poverty program, or a poverty program that's on the books and sounds good, but is inadequately funded, it might solve our conscience, and we might say that we are doing what we should, but when the fact is that we're not doing what we should be doing in this country to deal with this problem.
I'd lost 4 out of 5 primaries, I'd be finished off. And I said to myself that I'd abide by California. Hubert Humphrey got out after he was beaten in West Virginia. He could have gone on. And obviously it's up to the individual to decide that. But if we're interested in the cause, if we're interested in the country, and we're interested in the direction that we want the United States to move in, each one of us has to examine our own conscience and decide how that can best be done. And we've gone through these contests. We presented ourselves to the voters and permitted the voters to decide. That's the purpose of the primaries, and the voters have made their judgment. I wouldn't put it in those terms so much as I put it in terms that I think the primaries have indicated all across the country that the country and the Democratic Party wants to move in a different direction than they have over the period of the last 3 years. I think for the Democratic Convention and the delegates of the Democratic Convention to ignore that quite clear mandate, I think would be a terrible mistake. I think that if we look at the record of all of the primaries and how we've done respectively, that I think that I would hope that perhaps I have great respect for Senator McCarthy. I have the greatest respect for those who have been associated with him in the effort. I would hope that perhaps we could get together now after these primaries are completed and finished and start to work together to build up forces which would bring the Democratic Convention in a different direction than it's apparently headed, at least at the moment.
If we learned anything in the last summer and over the period of the last 30 years, what we've been doing hasn't been the answer. Perhaps it's been helpful, but what we've been doing has not been the answer. And we can't just continue doing just the same thing that we've been doing for the last 3 decades and hope that eventually all these problems are going to disappear, because as I said earlier, the Labor Department has said that the problem is getting worse, not better. The unemployment rate of those living in the ghetto is not going down despite the poverty program, despite all of these other programs. The unemployment rate is going up. The educational system is not getting better. The housing is not getting better. In the city of New York, we went from 420,000 dilapidated units to 540,000 dilapidated units since 1960. Now, I'm a Democrat and I support the Democratic administration. But the fact is that despite this legislation, we haven't moved in the right direction. I support a lot of this legislation. But I think that we have to use, find some different ideas, use some imagination. And it doesn't necessarily mean that what we've been doing for the last 30 years is necessarily correct.